Our last presenter is Adrienne. Adrienne, this program is hard. It's a lot of math, a lot of science, data analysis, thinking about complicated policy, complicated politics. And people get stressed out, and some people kind of show it. I know I would, but Adrienne was like the most calm, chill person ever at all times during this program. And, sitting here for 8.5 hours waiting to present. I don't know if anybody else has the poise, grace, composure I just know is going to be like totally cool with this. So Adrienne has been just amazing to have around, as apparently a great soccer coach for that almost championship soccer team. And I really enjoyed my conversations with Adrienne this year. We got to talk about a lot of things, especially religion, my own complex relationship with religion and spirituality. And I think that the vision that Adrienne projects of organized religion is pretty inspiring and completely different than what kind of scared me off from it. So really appreciate the topic here and appreciate the way Adrienne thought about this, and really enjoyed being a tiny little piece of this project. So thanks again, everybody, for coming, and I'll leave you with Adrienne.
Well, thank you, Corey, and thank you everybody that's here watching online, wonderful cohort. It's been nothing but a pleasure to be able to be on this journey, not just today through the 8.5 hours, but the whole rest of the year. So let me open this up. Alrighty, great. So I am presenting today on activating churches in the Episcopal Diocese of San Diego, and it's a case study in mainline Christian climate action. And this project really grew out of a need that I heard in my various faith communities that I have been a part of over the last year, or around this time in the last year, hearing that these faith communities were interested and committed to climate action, but they weren't really sure where to get started or what was already being done. And so in that year since, I have gotten to see firsthand how progressive Christians are mobilizing around the climate crisis and what theological, socio-political, and institutional challenges they face in doing so. So what I want to do today is to provide an alternate witness to the Christianity that dominates our news cycle, claiming to have God on their side. So with that, let us dive right in. So this is a brief outline of where we're going today. We'll cover background, case study, my findings, and my recommendations. So looking at the project background and diving right into definitions, I know I threw a lot of words on that title screen that people might not be super familiar with. So defining the main line, basically, if you think about the Christian tradition, we have Catholicism, Protestantism, and Orthodoxy. And so within the Protestant group, there's kind of a difference. There are evangelicals, fundamentalists. There's also what's basically like everybody else, which is the main line. And these churches have a deep historic root and influence in American society. Like 11 U.S. presidents were Episcopalians. Most of our Ivy Leagues and other institutions of higher education were started by some of these main lines. And these main lines, the churches include the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, United Methodist Church, the United Church of Christ, American Baptist churches, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Christian Church or Disciples of Christ, and smaller denominations like the Mennonites and Quakers. And so while the broad group of the main line is pretty diverse in its beliefs, it does skew whiter, wealthier, and more educated than other Christian groups. And I would like to give a special shout out because there are a bunch of wonderful BIPOC folks within the main line who are doing really important work and have been doing important work. And so that is why, because they are so diverse theologically, but also in terms of political belief and voting habits, that's why I'll be focusing on the progressive main line. About 16%, maybe 14%, of the US population identifies as white mainliners. Again, not all of them are progressive, but that's a pretty big group of people to be looking at. And this focus on the progressive faction, they already have been mobilizing for the climate crisis in many ways. And they are pretty liberal in their theologies, clergy, and social positions. So also defining creation care, this is basically Christianity's main term for environmental stewardship, and it's based on the Genesis account of creation, but it's not to be confused with like literal six-day creationism. There's quite an appreciation for science and evolution, especially within the main line. And this type of framework has deep theological wells to draw from, with transformative strands of liberation, ecofeminist, womanist, and queer theologies shaping the future of this discipline and how it gets lived out. And so why does this matter? What can the mainline offer? So in addition to those theological contributions, there is a lesser-known history of environmental justice and action within the mainline. So this picture right here is of United Church of Christ, Reverend Ben Chavis, and basically the United Church of Christ was pretty influential in resisting, unfortunately it was not a successful resistance, but in resisting a siting of a PCB landfill in Warren County, North Carolina, which was predominantly Black and low income. And they really kicked the door open for the environmental justice movement. They produced a report in 1987 on toxic waste and race in America, and that current is still part of their DNA today. Additionally, faithful climate action could be a potential for achieving collective action. We all know that there are many solutions to the climate crisis, but what we lack is collective action and the political will to actually enact these solutions. And so to address this, organized collective action is needed in every sector and at every level to disrupt the carbon status quo. I think that's been pretty apparent from all of our conversations today. And so progressive faith communities can be generative containers for such mobilization. And additionally, at the heart of the climate crisis is a crisis of relationship and how we treat the world and one another. So unfortunately, rather than attending to the sacredness of creation, certain Christian doctrines have severed the connection between matter and spirit, basically prioritizing the saving of souls and heavenly salvation at the expense of transformation and liberation in our earthly reality. So obviously this has had devastating consequences for groups outside of the dominant culture throughout history. And mainliners are currently in the process of recovering that sacred spirit and matter connection and their relationship to groups historically harmed by the church. To varying degrees, they're being successful in that. And so this is kind of some of the theoretical framework for how I conducted my analysis. So basically, there is a social movements researcher named Anna Peterson, and she says that in addition to providing tangible support like funding, spaces to meet, leaders for social movements such as the climate movement, faith communities can also contribute education, advocacy, and spiritual practices to the movement. So in terms of education, we all know that religious ideology can be powerful. Claiming to have God on your side, for better or worse, can really affect things. And in the case of the climate crisis, interwoven with many other struggles against oppressive status quos, religious backing, here in this case, can legitimize the struggle for a livable future for all. In terms of advocacy, this can look like just and compassionate political action and partnering with the wider community at the local, national, and global scale. And then in terms of spiritual practices, liturgies, sacraments, and spiritual disciplines like prayer or confession can also embody these spiritual convictions. And so really, Anna Peterson, she says, religious institutions mediate scale and sector, connecting the personal experience with larger political and communal frameworks. So again, it's like, how do we connect what you're experiencing or what your community might be experiencing in terms of environmental injustice, et cetera? How do we connect that with getting politically active and actually enacting change? So a little bit about my stakeholder. I had the privilege of working with the Episcopal Diocese of San Diego. They are the local expression of the Episcopal Church here in the region, and they comprise 42 parishes, even beyond the San Diego region. And basically, their creation care element is kind of one of many other focuses in terms of advocacy that they have. And so particularly kind of going down into the Creation Care Task Force, this started in 2021, and it was appointed by EDSD at the institutional level to focus on education, advocacy, church engagement, food justice, and communications. Some of that work particularly looks like stewarding a solar initiative, trying to get more solar panels up on church roofs, curating events and calls to action, hosting book studies, producing resources, and then what I'll be focusing on, which is activating actual church communities. So looking at my case study a little bit in more depth, my main research question is, have progressive mainline Christians been activated to respond to the climate crisis? How might they be, and why does it matter? And in my report, I have a secondary focus on the relationship between grassroots social movements and denominations' institutional structures to organize this climate action. So you might hear whispers of that, but it won't be a main focus in the rest of this report. And so basically, I looked at both the mainline and specifically EDSD's climate action in these 4 areas. And again, drawing back from Peterson's 3 contributions that faith communities can make. And again, I'll focus more on the case study of EDSD, but I will connect some of my findings to larger trends for the main line. And if you have specific questions about the structure and the institution and so forth, you can ask me in the Q&A section. So the process for mobilizing church communities for the Diocese of San Diego, it looked like starting in November. Basically, I worked with our little subcommittee to reach out to these 24 churches that flagged an interest in creation care based on a 2021 survey that they took on peace and justice ministries. So after reaching out to them, we invited them to one of 2 Zoom meetings that we held in January on why creation care is important and how the task force can help them get a ministry started at their church. So 12 churches attended, and that was like about 20 people. From there, we sent them this guide, which is basically like a 17-page PDF that was one of my main deliverables for the project, was basically a how-to guide and what resources are available to them, as well as kind of just next steps in getting started. So we sent that to those 12 churches, and currently we have like an active caseload kind of 16 churches who either have started or are in the process of starting a creation care ministry at their church. And there are 8 additional churches that are interested, but they weren't quite ready to get started. And so from there, I kind of looked at what these churches were doing or what they're hoping to do, and I will show some of the findings. So circling back to my main question, have progressive mainliners been activated to respond to the climate crisis? My answer is yes, and there is still a lot of work to do. So in terms, again, drawing back to those 3 contributions, in terms of education and formation, the Diocese of San Diego has been involved in community environmental fairs. They've hosted film series. They do adult education series, as well as EV and compost demos at different churches. The last 6 weeks, I've had the privilege of co-facilitating a book study with the Episcopal Church near UTC, right down the hill, on Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, and that's been a really transformative experience, I would say, for that faith community. And then that's pretty on par for the rest of the main line. So these other denominations are also producing resources for their churches and for larger Christian climate action. They're doing theological discussions, systematic theology publications. Again, this is the UCC Toxic Waste and Race report. They updated that in 2007 as well to see how and if those trends have changed. And then this last picture is of a dear friend. This is Mother Rachel Tabor Hamilton. She's Shakan First Nations and the first Indigenous priest in the Diocese of Olympia up in Seattle. And this is her giving a talk at COP26 as part of the Episcopal delegation on the importance of centering Indigenous people in nature-based solutions. So it Again, lots of different ways and entry points for education on this topic. In terms of advocacy, EDSD's bishop released a statement right before Earth Day this last year, basically reiterating EDSD's commitment to addressing the climate emergency, which we strategically tried to get her to work that phrase into this statement, and basically paired it with some actions for families and churches to take. And the task force is also part of the Interfaith Coalition for Earth Justice, pictured here on the right there at a protest in downtown. And then some parishes are also advocating with San Diego Organizing Project, which basically activates churches and faith communities, interfaith communities, for political action. So they're advocating with them to support initiatives, for instance, the transportation justice bill that's going to be on the ballot, and that's backed by the Environmental Health Coalition. And so mainline denominations are similarly working on intersectional justice efforts, repairing that spirit and matter connection. Grassroots organizations like the Interfaith Power and Light, as well as the Poor People's Campaign, are also pretty involved in divestment and other pipeline fights and so forth. You can also ask me more about divestment, which is kind of interesting, but we're going to keep moving. And then in terms of liturgy and practices, EDSD has curated a bunch of different events, liturgies, prayers, and music for the Earth Month, as well as the season of creation. This is a priest presiding over Eucharist at a retreat center in Julian. This is the Poor People's Campaign hosting a Palm Sunday service where they called Joe Manchin to repent. It was at a coal blockade in West Virginia, so more of that would be great. And then this last one is some priests in Pennsylvania blessing solar panels. So again, more of that would be great. And then in terms of my recommendations, so these are pretty general, and I'm going to focus more on education, but basically kind of a sum up of what is already happening. So in terms of education, for EDSD and the Episcopal Church, it would be great for them to produce a curriculum on creation care and climate solutions. They already have something for anti-racism, which has seen over 20,000 people go through in the last 3 years. So they could deploy that to churches. It's super duplicatable and easy. And then I'm not going to spend very much time. Again, you can ask me more about abolishing Christian empire, biblical literalism, and the doctrine of original sin later. But I could talk your ear off about that. And then just to conclude, the larger community also can partner with faith communities in adaptation planning. So because churches have deep place-based relationship with community stakeholders, they often know who is most vulnerable in their community. So like with heat and strategies to address heat, that could be really helpful. And then again, churches are wanting to mobilize, especially these progressive mainlines. So in conclusion, Christianity has a lot to account for, but also a lot to offer the climate movement, and progressive mainliners are one group embodying what faithful climate action can look like. In sum, redemption happens when we wake up to the sacred interrelationship of all things and translate it into action. Thank you so much. Any questions?
Thanks for the presentation. It was great. I think you mentioned at one point, you talked a bit about education, and you showed a few books, like I don't remember the titles, but there were 2 books alongside the report from 1987, 2000, updated in 2007. The books provided, were they, and the education that you're speaking of, how much of that is sort of, those 2 books, and then how much do those books talk about sort of the science behind climate change, and how much of it is more lent towards just kind of looking at it from a spiritual angle? And is there a sort of a spectrum there that where the needle kind of shifts depending on the author and the target audience? And can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. So I would say like the Sacred Earth book, they have some passing comments about, obviously humanity is headed for doom if we don't act soon. This book particularly, because it has climate change in it, I was actually pretty impressed with their grasp of the science and their explanation of the science. But I would say, yeah, depending on like which denomination it's coming from, again, who the audience is. I spoke with one woman who works for Interfaith Power and Light, and she oversees the Southern California region, and she's been in this space for like 20 years, and she says that when she talks to folks, like when she talks to evangelicals and even some Catholics, it's very much like, we need, everybody should have clean air. We want to make sure that, health and thriving is here. Whereas if she talks to some more progressive folks, it's more of like, okay, what are your divestment? What are the strategies? It's like a little bit of a different focus. So I would say that's right on, yeah. Mm-hmm. Zane?
Could you please expand on what abolishing Christian empire means?
Yes, thank you. I'm so glad you asked. This is my favorite topic. So I think my cohort has heard me talk a little bit about this, maybe too much. But basically, actually in that book, the Sacred Earth and Sacred Soul book, it goes into kind of the history of how that doctrine has been used. So dating back to the 400s, when Christianity became the religion of the empire, the Roman Empire, basically as the empire was expanding, that doctrine started becoming more and more prevalent, and they started squelching like basically anything else that was like, hey, shouldn't we be like protecting people, or like, I think if God created all things, like we should probably see it as sacred. They were like, oh no, you are a heretic, and we need to keep feeding the empire and backing the empire, because if we see people as sacred, if we see the earth as sacred, we can't now justify our expansion. So that, and again, like these folks were considered heretics, they are excommunicated, and you just like wonder what the world would look like if that doctrine wasn't so widely spread and still has such a big, obvious impact on a lot of our social and political issues today. Yeah.
Is this movement at all interacting with the Catholic Church? I mean, there are progressive Catholics,
Totally.
believe it or not. And
Yes.
Since this group also tends to be trending white, and
Mhm.
a lot of the Latinos are actually,
Mhm.
Latinx are actually adhering to the Catholic Church, it would be, I think, very useful to include that.
Yes, that's a great question. I'm really glad you asked. So obviously, when I started, I was like, I'm going to look at all interfaith climate action. And then it was like, okay, that's way too much. And then I was like, I'm going to look at all Christian climate action. And that was even too much. So that's why I had to really drill down to just the progressive mainline. But yes, Pope Francis, he is like the ecological pope. He's doing a lot of wonderful things. And a lot of his, his prioritization of the ecological, but also the economic issues related to climate crisis, they all stem from liberation theology, or a lot of it stems from liberation theology. And so actually the Diocese of San Diego, they're pretty progressive as well, and which is a really cool thing. The woman that I spoke with at Interfaith Power and Light, she's Catholic, and she was just telling me, like, depending on your bishop or even your priest, if their political leaning is one way or the other, you might not be getting exposed to a lot of this. And again, that's kind of where the institution comes in. But yeah, we are working with the Catholic Diocese a little bit in the beginning stages of possibly an interfaith tree planting initiative. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of crossover. I think that also working with other social movements like the Interfaith Power and Light organization, that helps to overlap some of these, not just within the Christian tradition, but with other faiths as well. So yeah. Okay, thank you.